Dzień dobry Państwu.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Witam Państwa w drugim dniu naszej konferencji Kierunek Stalinizm po formalnych i mniej formalnych obradach. Zaczniemy od dużego, mocnego uderzenia panelu, który się będzie składał z 5 wystąpień. Pierwszym naszym prelegentem będzie pan Mario Jareb z Chorwackiego Instytutu Historycznego. Doktor Mario Jareb jest zatrudniony właśnie w Chorwackim Instytucie Historycznym w Zagrzebiu. Specjalizuje się w badaniach nad ruchem ustaszowsko-dornobrańskim w okresie międzywojennym oraz okresie II wojny światowej, ze szczególnym uwzględnieniem losów Kościoła katolickiego w komunistycznej Jugosławii. Również stypendystą programu Fulbrighta, a jego temat wystąpienia brzmi Wprowadzenie komunizmu w Chorwacji i Jugosławii pod koniec II wojny światowej oczami pierwszego chorwackiego, jugosłowiańskiego dysydenta Bogdana Radici. Panie doktorze, zapraszam.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here to be able to present something on the topic, the imposition of communism in Croatia and Yugoslavia, seen through the eyes of Bogdan Radica, the first Croatian and Yugoslav dissident. So he became one already in November 1945, so pretty early. So who was Bogdan Radica? He was a journalist, publicist, and intellectual, as I said, of Croatian descent, born in Split in Croatia at the beginning of the 20th century. And since the beginning of the 1930s, he served in Yugoslav diplomacy in the capacity of press attaché in several legations of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And finally, in 1940, he was transferred to Washington, D.C. to serve at the same capacity in the legation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, so to the United States. So there, in April 1941, he was observing the outbreak of the war in Yugoslavia, so the aggression of Axis powers on Yugoslavia, dismemberment of Yugoslavia, and of course he remained in the United States throughout that whole period of the war, writing, promoting Yugoslav and Croatian interests in the United States among the Western allies. But since at the beginning he was serving Royal or the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, in 1943 he switched to another side. He realized that, or actually he hoped that some changes would be necessary to transform Yugoslavia into the state or the nation of equal peoples or nations. So in 1943 he became an activist or even propagandist for the new movement of Josip Broz Tito, so the leader of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. But of course Bogdan Radica didn't promote his movement for that fact, but he was hoping that that movement would bring something else. So as he said in one of his articles published in 1946, in 1943 I was stationed in New York as the head of the press service of the Royal Yugoslav government. I had served that government since 1928 in Belgrade, in Athens, in Geneva, in Washington. I nevertheless felt that in pre-war Yugoslavia there had been too little democracy. In that mood I read the news that Marshal Tito's first National Liberation Assembly had made an electrifying declaration. This declaration was for a free and equal federation of all Yugoslav peoples. It was for democracy, under brackets. It breathed the spirit of a new country reborn to freedom. I weighed my duty to the old Yugoslavia and to the new. I preferred the democratic federated Republic of Yugoslavia to King Peter's monarchy. I preferred Tito to Mihailović. I resigned from my position and put my pen at the service of Tito and the American liberal press. So that's how he switched his position, and by the end of the war he remained on that position. His political views were very liberal even before the war, and he was acting in that way, so promoting the liberal democracy, and was hoping obviously that the new movement of Tito would bring something like that. His views were actually clearly expressed in his book, published already in 1940, at the very beginning of the Second World War, The Agony of Europe, in which he also promoted those ideas that liberal democracy should prevail in Europe, the rule of law should prevail in Europe, versus then present totalitarian regimes, primarily of the Third Reich or Hitler's Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and of course Stalin's Soviet Union. So at the very end of the war, the agreement was reached between Royal Yugoslav government and Tito's movement. So a new government of joint government of Tito and King Peter was formed already in mid 1944, but only in March 1945 it happened that officials and some ministers of the old Royal Yugoslav government moved to what was already resurrected Yugoslav state with the capital of Belgrade, and among these officials was also Bogdan Radica. So he arrived to resurrected Yugoslavia full of hopes that in a new state democracy would prevail, that all Yugoslav nations would be satisfied with their new position in their federated or federal republics. So when he arrived, he was acted that way, full of hopes and how to say, eager to work for the future of his own people. But what happened was that very soon he realized that things were going to take another course. In Yugoslavia, he became the head of the foreign press department in the Ministry of Information of New Yugoslavia, Democratic Federative Yugoslavia. And as such, he was hoping that he would be able to establish contacts with foreign press, primarily Western press, foreign dignitaries and diplomats. But he soon realized that something like that wouldn't be possible, that in his own ministry, in spite of the fact that the minister was also one of those old guys from the Royal Yugoslav government, actually the officials of the Communist Party keep all the power in their hands. So what happened to him was that he also received so-called characteristics that was, how to say, an usual way how communists would deal with people in their institutions. So each of them should have some paper that would describe his own activities. So Bogdan Radica was among those people who met actually the fact that someone else had composed characteristica for him. And very soon, at the very beginning of his service in Yugoslavia, he had to talk to his chief, called Sveta Nedeljković, who was the personal officer of the Ministry of Information and a member of the Communist Party. And this is what Radica wrote later. Nedeljković startled me by saying that there was a black mark against me for having written a book, The Agony of Europe, published in Belgrade in 1940. It was an anti-fascist book and it had been suppressed by the occupying Germans. Why should such a book be challenged by Nedeljković, a communist? I was soon to learn. The book was anti-fascist, but it was not pro-communist. It was pro-democratic. Nedeljković warned me that my attitudes in the future would be watched. I was thus put on notice that in this new People's Front government, the non-communist participants were expected to be satisfactory to the communist participants. The others were to be the front, while the communists, even if the background, were to be the bosses. So he learned that at the very beginning of his service in Yugoslavia. So being in that position, although he was not in position to talk to foreign diplomats on the ground he would like to do, or to have contacts with foreign officials and dignitaries, he was still able to observe what was going on around him, and very soon he learned about the main characteristics of the new government, and actually realized that behind everything in the country there was a firm fist of the Communist Party that was able and was trying to control every aspect of life in new Yugoslavia. So he soon realized that the main aspect of that life is the spread of fear among the population. So by spreading the fear, it was easier for the party to control everything. So in one of his articles in 1946, when he fled Yugoslavia, so he wrote the following sentences. To understand what is going on in Yugoslavia, one must appreciate the full impact of communist rule at every level of national life. There is no escape. The government is everywhere and takes great pains to ensure that no citizen remains unaffected. So he tried to describe that fear and actually the impact of communist rule by describing the case of the city of Zagreb, so capital of Croatia. So he wrote the following sentences. Let me describe the anatomy of organized fear in one city I know, Zagreb, capital of the so-called People's Republic of Croatia. Like other Yugoslav cities, Zagreb is ruled by a local unit, the Odbor, or board, of the National Front. This corresponds to the Russian Soviet. The city itself is divided into several districts, each called a rayon, also kind of smaller district. Each rayon is further divided into street units, each of which has its own street committee, as is also the case in the Soviet Union. Finally, each street unit is split into small sections so that on this lowest level every person can be intimately acquainted with the affairs of every other. The head of the street committee is a member of the Communist Party, referred to in Yugoslavia simply as the party, so the Communist Party remained the only party, all other were banned or their members put in prison or executed, and so on and so on. So, and is usually selected from among the most fanatical members. These street bosses are the representatives of the government in their districts, and in their limited field of operation, they enjoy unlimited sovereignty. There is no appeal from their decisions. Through the street committees, they issue all ration cards for food, coal, and everything else necessary for life. What is also, symptomatic for that system is what Radica notice is that one of the most terrifying fears of the totalitarian state is its practice of promoting fear and mutual distrust in families. A girl I knew of in the 4th class of Zagreb College was instructed to investigate confidentially the political attitude of her schoolmates and families. The parents who became aware of this kind of scrutiny do not dare to talk freely before their children, much less attempt to counteract the party indoctrination. I have often seen parents stop talking when their children come home from school or from party meetings. The children's reports are presented to the school and street committees and have an important bearing on the parents' characteristics. So the whole system was backed by a new secret police, which was there to execute all kind of verdicts, all kind of investigation, in order to, perpetrate continual cleansing of the society from those reactionary elements, as they were labeled. So in Yugoslav case, and of course in Croatian case too, that the name of that secret police that was modeled after the pattern of NKVD was well known after the acronym OZNA. So this is Odjeljenje za zaštitu naroda, or the Department for the Protection of the People. So Radica noticed that already while being there, that the Yugoslav secret political police force is known as the OZNA. OZNA means Department for the Defense of the People. It was organized by Russian specialists in espionage and liquidation. Its head, Lieutenant General Alexander Rankovic, is empowered to arrest without warrant and to execute without trial any citizen deemed to be an enemy of the people. OZNA has one section for control of civilians, another for control of the army, another for control of Yugoslav in foreign countries, another for control of foreigners in Yugoslavia, and finally, a very special section for control of the government itself. That is for the control of all government officials, including communists. The Communist Party actually conducts continuous espionage upon itself. It's like an onion. It is in layers. You have to peel off layer after layer before you come to the core. The core is a network of spies. So that onion, how to say, onion procedure or theory was also later, if I'm not wrong, how to say, described by Mátyás Rákosi, Hungarian one who also had the chance to experience the communist regime in Hungary. So those who were actually lucky to escape from the hands of OZNA were usually or very often brought to so-called people courts. But these courts were not courts as we understand them today, but they were something completely different. These courts were specially designed to trial and execute enemies, all of kinds of reactionaries, or the enemies of the people as they were usually described before their courts. And actually it's hard to say that they were courts in let's say democratic sense of that world. So what Radica noticed was that any deviation from the way of life prescribed by the party leaders directly to the people courts. One of the cruelest means of intimidation devised by the regime. The judges in these courts are invariably men who know nothing of law, but they are always good members of the party. The technique of the court follows the Russian pattern closely. The audience, which consists only of party sympathizers, continually interrupts the proceedings, hissing the defendant and hooting down his attorney, who cannot be counted on for a very vigorous defense anyway. Witnesses are often taken from the courtroom gallery. This is meant to further the impression that it is the people who are the judges in the new Yugoslavia. Actually, the judicial processes are no more democratic than lynch law. The people's courts have banned all enemies of the regime. They have also taken over almost all private property. So that was actually the main purpose of those courts, to bring some verdict. Usually or very often those defendants would be executed, and the main thing after that would be the confiscation of their property, so to be transferred to the state and to the party. The Constitution guarantees the right of private property, and so expropriation takes place only and indirectly through the device of conviction for collaboration. Before the People's Court, every property owner or private employer is a collaborationist, a fascist, a war criminal, or a profiteer. I know of an industrialist in Zagreb whose oil business had been requisitioned by the Germans during the war. He was therefore considered a collaborationist, and his property was duly confiscated by the People's Court. So this was the way how communists ruled in that very early stage of their rule in communist Yugoslavia and Croatia. So the main goal was to, establish total control over the society, to liquidate all the enemies, and to rule without any interruption, any obstacle, and of course to acquire so many followers that would blindly follow that new regime. So in writing, I'll present more, so you'll be able to read more about Radica's impressions. So he spent several months in Yugoslavia. When he realized what was going on, he did everything to leave Croatia and Yugoslavia. So in November 1945, he was lucky to flee Yugoslavia to return to the United States. And in 1946, he published three articles on what was going on in Yugoslavia, what he witnessed during his stay there. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation and for keeping to the time. It was perfect timing. And this was an interesting paper because it shows that there were a lot of differences between the countries in Central Europe, but there were a lot of shared experiences. And that's why we're at this conference, to reflect on this, to examine these similarities. Now I want to invite Dr. Këlliçi from the University of Tirana. He is a lecturer at the university. He's published numerous articles about the relations between Albania and other countries or institutions, with Libya, with the PLO, and he also studies relations of People's Poland with the Global South, and also Albanian students studying abroad in the years 1979-1990. He spent time in Poland. He was at the university in Krakow. His paper will be about the politicization of motherhood in the early years of socialism in Albania. Dr. Këlliçi.
So, thank you very much to the organizers for the conference. In my paper, I examine how from the very outset state socialism in Albania constructed mother and child relationship in a dual political dynamic. First, it functioned as a site of care and reproduction, emphasizing the foundational role of the mother in the physical and emotional development of the child. Second, it became a key ideological and political arena through which the state shaped the figure of the mother, and through her the political formation of the child. The central hypothesis of this article is that in Albanian state socialism constructed the concept of the motherhood, in particular in its initial phase, that was deeply rooted in the broader logic of modernizing regimes, whether liberal or illiberal, where the regulation of life and its continuity stood as its primarily objective. Within this framework, the figure of the mother emerged as a critical social construct throughout which the state articulated policies of reproduction, child rearing, and transformation of the private sphere. The relationship between socialism and women, especially mothers, followed a dual trajectory, divergent in its means but convergent in goals. In promising women emancipation, socialist regime aimed to incorporate them into the production sphere by integrating them into the workforce. This inclusion was intending to disrupt and transform the patriarchal family structure, with the state assuming the role traditionally held by the patriarch. While this promise was in principle emancipatory, in its practical realization was constrained by at least in the Albanian case, by the Albanian socioeconomic condition. In early socialist Albania, industrial development was minimal, and agriculture remained the main sector where women would be employed in mass. This did not preclude efforts to expand women participation in the workforce. However, due to its limited economic opportunities, motherhood and childcare remained central to the social identity of women. Unlike the Soviet Union, where women received mixed messages about sexual revelation and pronatalism, communist Albania emphasized motherhood as its primarily ideological and social ideal. To implement policies, Albanian communist regime created the Albanian Association of Women, which was not primarily designed to advance women emancipation, but rather serve as an organizational mechanism throughout which the state and the party could control and mobilize women. According to its statute, women's emancipation was subordinate to the larger objective of rallying women around the party and engaging them in the construction of socialism. The elevation of women's status during socialism was framed less as a project of genuine emancipation and more as a function of training women for labor combined with the enduring role of motherhood. The Women's Association functioned as a typical Stalinist mass organization. Rather than advocating for women interests or perspectives, it acted as an instrument for integrating women into the socialist system. It provided a little to no space for initiative, debate, or autonomy. From 1945-6 to 1948, the organization focused in its discourse on promoting the image of working women by not redefining gender roles, but by elevating their narrative of emancipation rooted in women's wartime contribution and their continuing mobilization in the national reconstruction. In parallel, the women's organization also became the state's principal partner in public health initiatives, participating in vaccination drives, campaigns, hygiene campaigns, establishing nurseries and kindergarten, and organization of collective canteens. These activities were voluntary and modeled on the Soviet precedents like the Obshnetvica or worker wives movement, even though with little or less autonomy and initiative. By the late 40s and the mid-50s, the women's organization shifted its engagement from women's education to maternal child care. Even the women organization members acknowledged that among all their activities, those related to childcare were most popular. During this period, the figure of the mother partially aligned with the ideal of socialist women liberation, but portraying the mother as a primarily caregiver centered around family life. In the media, such as the Shqiptarja e Re or the New Albanian, a journal, two dominant figures emerged, the young working or volunteering woman and the devoted mother. The father, meanwhile, was relegated to the margin of the family structure, while the mother and child dyad became central, institutionalized, monitored, and embedded in the apparatus of the state. Maternal care and socialist education began as early as 1946. Under the party guidance and modeled on the Soviet experience, the women's organization initiated the creation of Mother and Child Association. At first glance, this may appear as a retreat from the socialist ideal of women full integration into the labor force. However, given the post-war emergency context and the limited infrastructure of state care, the association emerged as a stopgap solution to address women and child welfare needs. Founded in 21st January 1946, the association may aim to reshape motherhood as a practice grounded in science and education. Women, especially new mothers, were taught how to raise and care children according to the state-approved standards. Child rearing was no longer considered a private matter. Instead, the socialist conception of motherhood required collective oversight, realized through state mechanism and education. The statute of the association defined women primarily through their reproductive role, subordinating labor and social emancipation to the mission of child rearing. This did not signal a complete departure from the ideological triad of women, labor, liberation, but rather a reorientation. Labor was pushed to the background, while motherhood was recast as a prestigious social mission. Mothers were expected to be educated in childcare, guided by the pedagogy of science, and to become true mothers who embodied socialist values in both family and society. The mother and child relationship became critical nexus between the private and public spheres. Education for mothers emphasized trust in public health institutions from pregnancy through early childhood, including prenatal visits, hospital births, vaccination, daycare, and kindergarten enrollment. Between the late 1940s and early 50s, mother and child courses were attended by approximately 8,000 women annually, which participation combined elements of coercion, bureaucratic expectation, and genuine interest. The content of these courses was primarily medical, not ideological, with a focus on disease prevention, hygiene, and breaking with harmful traditional practice. Rising female literacy enabled the use of pamphlets and printed materials to disseminate information about child and health care. One prominent example of this campaign was against summer diarrhea, a disease which was caused a significant mortality in rural and impoverished areas. In 1948, the Women's Association collaborated with the Ministry of Health, launching an extensive propaganda campaign to combat this illness. Due to widespread illiteracy among women, propaganda was primarily delivered orally during small meetings held by midwife, nurses, and members of the organization with women. The materials discussed with women took the form of simple stories, reflecting the high levels of illiteracy and the significant cultural background they faced. One of such materials was a small pamphlet titled "Summer Fevers, a Dangerous Disease," published and authorized by the Ministry of Health. At the center of this pamphlet is Lula, a young woman who has just given birth to a son, whom she cares, but without sufficient knowledge. Lula lives in a patriarchal household under the care of her mother-in-law, who dictates how Lula should care for the newborn. After several months during summer, when Lula must tend to the agricultural work, the child is left and the mother-in-law under the mother-in-law care, but suddenly falls ill with fevers and dies a few days later. Despite the grief, the child's death is barely mourned, either by the mother-in-law or Lula herself, who consoles herself with the thought of another pregnancy. This pedagogical approach framed the material ignorance as a threat to the child's survival and cast the traditional knowledge embodied by the older female relative as harmful. In contrast, the state presented itself as the sole legitimate source of knowledge and protection. The mother was made responsible for a child's survival, but only through the mediation of state institutions. Thus, the child becomes an object of dual care. The mother provides day-to-day attention, while the state established the standards for the proper care and medical supervision. In this model, the body of the mother was disciplined through medicalized education and surveillance. Socialist motherhood, therefore, was not merely about emotional care, but about conforming to the biopolitical regime that sought to preserve life and ensure health for future citizens. Under state socialism, Albania pursued both ideological and pragmatic objectives regarding the role of women. Whilst official discourse emphasized women liberation and gender equality, in practice, socialist policies overwhelmingly target mothers. Socialist motherhood emerged as a construct that bore strong continuity with the traditional model, albeit under the new guise of scientific and institutional rationality. This emphasized the reproduction and care, and it was shaped by several contextual factors: widespread female illiteracy, underdeveloped industry, and fragile social care infrastructure. As a result, the regime prioritized maternal education and child care over women's integration to the industrial labor. The socialist state promised extensive support for child rearing, while simultaneously placing the burden of responsibility on women's shoulders. The mother was considered an ignorant subject whom the state socialists sought to modernize through science and pedagogy. Tradition was redefined not as a repository of wisdom, but an obstacle to progress. While in later decades the figure of the grandmother and the elderly would be romanticized, in the early socialist period, older women, especially mother-in-laws, were vilified as symbols of ignorance and patriarchy. In contrast, the new socialist mother was expected to be literate, medically informed, and the vigilant guardian of her child's health. She was both the first educator and the first health worker for her child, responsible for linking the family to public institutions of care, education, and work. Ultimately, socialist motherhood was medicalized, politicized, and instrumentalized as an essential pillar of the biopolitical management of life under socialism. Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy za również ciekawy wykład.
Thank you so much for this paper to Dr. Këlliçi, who showed us that it wasn't just about achieving the educational aims of raising a young person, a child, within this new socialist society, but your paper also touched upon some topics that have been forgotten by historians dealing with the 20th century, namely a demographic policy, which is important today and was important in the immediate post-war period. In the meantime, we are moving on, or rather we are remaining close to topics related to education. And our next speaker is Monika Wiśniewska, Dr. Monika Wiśniewska from the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is a historian of education. She is also the editor of an academic periodical devoted to the history of education, published by the University of Warsaw. Over the next 20 minutes, she will be talking about state, children, institutional childcare in socialist countries as exemplified by the Polish People's Republic and the German Democratic Republic.
Dziękuję pięknie za możliwość zabrania głosu. Celem mojego referatu jest zasygnalizowanie wybranych problemów dotyczących instytucjonalnej opieki nad dzieckiem w krajach socjalistycznych.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. The purpose of my paper is to present selected issues related to institutional childcare in socialist countries. I will be talking about orphanages in Poland and Kinderheime, Jugendheime, the German, East German equivalent. I will focus on selected legal issues, although I hope that you will get interested in this subject. I would like to introduce major topics like whether socialist countries inherited childcare law, family law, from the earlier periods, or did they try to make new laws regarding children, why and on what foundations. Secondly, I will look at whether the law which regulated childcare in socialist countries, whether it was modeled on the USSR and how was it received. And thirdly, because the latter half of the 20th century ushered in an intense developments in child protection and related regulations, I will ask whether the idea of child care, of children's rights, did it reach the other side of the Iron Curtain, and was it reflected in family and guardianship law in socialist countries? Of course, I'm not the first scholar to be dealing with these topics. Let me mention some German scholars like Christian Sachse, who was also the co-author of a German report on violence against children in institutional care in the German Democratic Republic. So I will, from the institutional angle, he composed a monograph looking at institutions and different childcare structures. There was also Angelika Cessebrun-Benz, who published Stiefkinder der Republik, the stepchildren of the German Democratic Republic, and hence the inspiration for my title, State Children. So Benz's work shows the other side of childcare. She looks at the experience of children who went through these care homes. She did wide-ranging research in former orphanages in East Germany, and she also conducted interviews. So there's a biographical research element in her work. That's usually of more interest to readers. Another scholar is the person we see bottom center. This is an author, but also a professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin, Eberhard Manschatz. In his work, he highlights the perspective of those who set up the system, the East German system of child care. He also headed the Ministry of Education in East Germany. And he was sort of the face, the poster person, not to say poster child for child care, much like Margot Honecker, also pictured. Among Polish authors, I would mention Professor Marian Balcerek, who wrote mostly in the 80s in communist Poland, but these works are foundational for any scholars of education or child care, and they are still topical today. Another important thing is that Marian Balcerek was the head of the Department of Research Organization and Educational Programs at the Ministry of Education. He was also director of the Institute for Youth Problems, or Youth Problem Studies, and this was an experimental facility created under Gierek in communist Poland. So just imagine there were such institutions as well in other socialist countries. Members of these institutes, directors like Marian Balcerek, would meet every once in a while to attend joint seminars and conferences, exchange experiences, the outcomes of their research work conducted in socialist countries on child care and child education or child raising. Of course, these institutes received directions from Moscow. They were centrally managed, but I would still appreciate their research. At the Archive of New Records in Warsaw, you can find the documents produced by this institute, and it's quite a neat resource which hasn't been examined in full. Another important author, Professor Maria Kolankiewicz, University of Warsaw, long-time social educator, but also long-time director of an orphanage for very small children in Warsaw, Nowogrodzka 75. It's worth visiting. There's also a museum there that she supervises. She is also my mentor and the author of some great educational/historical publications. Another mentor of mine is Professor Marek Andrzejewski, an expert on civil law, an expert on family law, and the head of the Center for Family Law and Children's Rights at the Institute of Legal Sciences, Polish Academy of Sciences. In an earlier period, he worked in several communist orphanages in communist Poland. He was also one of the founders, one of the creators of guardianship and family law that is still in force today. Another important figure is Professor Piotr Fiedorczyk. I have consulted him on various occasions, and he is a comparative, he deals with comparative law, and his work is also an important basis for scholars who strive to compare law and the trials held in socialist countries. He got me in touch with Professor Saski Lettmeyer, Department of Law, University of Hamburg, who helped me reach German experts or East German experts like Martin Loing from the Institute for Ostrecht in Regensburg, and maybe I'll end here. Because I will be discussing legal aspects today, I will also be drawing on normative sources, which I will discuss in a moment. But first of all, I would like to provide some general information about the institutional childcare systems in communist Poland and East Germany. Orphanages were part of the landscape of socialist childcare as sort of a typical institution, but that's not the case. Actually, their care only covered a very small percentage of children. In Poland, there were some 400 children's homes or orphanages which looked after around 30,000 children. There were more children in the immediate post-war period. They were first and foremost natural orphans. There were some 1.5 million such orphans in Poland after the war. In Germany, that number was 2.5 million. And there were increasing numbers of natural orphans in these orphanages. So children who had parents, whose parents were alive, but the family couldn't take care of them, was inefficient in providing a child care for some reason. Here I could also say that in East Germany, about 500,000 children went through the foster care, the orphanage system. So one symbol of institutional violence against children and young people in East Germany was the Torgau facility, a closed facility, whose charges experienced long-term violence. Even if they left Torgau, they continued to experience mental health problems and deficits that made it impossible for them to function normally or with dignity in society, and they remained in some way within the care system. Other aspects of socialist childcare, orphan care, included the monopolization of care, so forcing out entities that were not sanctioned by the state, ideological education, indoctrination of the children, transferring Soviet models, collective educational models like Kairov's and Makarenko's. It was done with great intensity until the thaw. After the thaw, the previous models, previous educators were reintroduced, or their thought, their philosophies, like Kazimierz Wiśniewski, Kazimierz Jerzewski, or Janusz Korczak, whom you might know, a flagship figure. Here we see on the picture younger children on the left and older children on the right. In socialist countries, child care was divided up between two ministries. The Ministry of Health looked after institutions that cared for young children up to 3 years old. Older children ended up in institutions that were overseen by the Ministry of Education. And that had quite dramatic consequences because, first and foremost, siblings would be split up. A young sister might stay behind in the young children's home. The older brother would graduate onto an older children's orphanage. Connections, bonds would be severed. There was a sense of alienation and loneliness. So the small child home, most of these children ended up being adopted, but those who didn't qualify for various reasons were redirected to so-called state orphanages, and these children, these little children, were removed from their natural environments. Another problem having to do with the fact that the Ministry of Education oversaw some orphanages involved children's migrations, and another problem was that the Ministry of Education, because that's mostly where I do my research on, it didn't see these young wards, these young charges, as children who should be provided with an environment resembling a family. It was seen more as an extension of school. There was no reintegration of families or support for families. If such things were provided, this was mostly at the initiative of very passionate directors, very passionate teachers, educators. And the orphanages varied to a large extent. In socialist childcare homes, there were also communist organizations. Here we have an example from East Germany. The pioneers, whereas older children were part of the Freie Deutsche Jugend, which was a wing of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany. It wasn't mandatory, but in practice the children had to join. Do we see a change of paradigm when it comes to institutional care during this period? Here we have the Freie Deutsche Jugend, Neues Leben, charges of a children's home. Did the paradigm change over time? In the People's Republic of Poland, there was gradual change. It wasn't that nothing changed and things stayed the same. Why did things change? Well, in communist Poland, there was still some grassroots initiative, educators, and eventually also social organizations in the 80s. But even those sanctioned by the state, they would apply pressure in order to reduce the number of children living in enclosed facilities and to redirect them into foster care, so facilities resembling a family. And this trend intensified in the 80s, and so-called foster homes, foster families began to be set up. But this pro-family trend, this pro-family tendency of foster care is still a very sensitive thing. It's sensitive to fluctuations in the economic situation. If there's an economic crisis, orphanages are always a sort of safety valve. What did this look like in East Germany? According to my initial reconnaissance, my initial research, we see that things didn't really change much in East Germany. There were some small reforms, some small efforts to modernize, but they didn't really affect the lives of charges. It didn't evolve towards family-like systems. Instead, the facilities are remembered as sort of neglected by the Ministry of Education. The ministry was more interested in re-educating so-called difficult youth in Spezialheime, facilities for juveniles. But what happened with these children was not really investigated by the state. These facilities received less funding. This is the picture that emerges from the literature, but I also looked through quite a lot of visual materials, and I can see that this landscape was in fact quite diverse, quite differentiated, although I don't know if it was as differentiated as in Poland. I would have to do more research. So in East Germany, the system was rather oppressive. Maybe that's a generalization, but I think that this title, state children, this term is appropriate for German facilities, as seen in the fact that the Bundestag around 2010 set up a compensation fund for former charges of orphanage facilities in East Germany in the 1950s and 60s. So I think that sort of confirms that the system was oppressive. If we look at the other side, behind the other side of the Iron Curtain, so West Germany, we have to admit that the situation there was not ideal either, because even though child care and orphanages were largely decentralized and up to 65% of facilities were organized by churches and religious organizations, there was the education was quite conservative, 19th century style, very rigid, very devotional, very religious, and the children raised in that system were also victimized. In the 1970s, this educational style was reformed, but many mistakes were made along the way. The Bundestag also allotted compensation to victims of West German facilities for children. I think it's important to mention that just for the sake of comparison. Now some legal issues. So on the one hand, we can see that childcare law became very modern. To quote the German historian Professor Jürgen Koch, who said that modernization is not always a positive thing if society's weakest are victimized. If there is injustice, then we need to assess modernization for its effects. Law was mostly a socialist law regarding child care was largely based on equality between children born to married couples and those born out of wedlock. So that was a positive aspect. So what is happening in post-war Poland? Poland enters the post-war period when it comes to family and guardianship law. It enters with a legal mosaic. So it inherited four main legal systems from pre-war Poland. In the East, the Napoleonic Code, the Civil Code of the Kingdom of Poland, plus a law on improving the condition of children born out of wedlock. So in the West and the former Western gubernias of Russia, there was some archaic laws from the Russian Empire. In former Galicia, the Allgemeines Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch was in force, so the Austrian Civil Code. And in the West, they had the most modern, maybe not chronologically, but in terms of the solutions. The German Civil Code was in force, the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch of 1896. So what was happening to the population? So with four legal systems inherited by Poland after the war, people are migrating. They're moving east to west and coming in contact with different solutions regarding children born out of wedlock, foster care, adoption. This is post-World War I. So why did interwar Poland not unify? Why didn't it unify its family law, its children's law? Well, there were attempts to codify or unify the law, but they ended with drafts, proceeded no further than drafts. Because in the Second Polish Republic, there was growing awareness of the handicaps experienced by children born out of wedlock. These children were stigmatized. They would usually end up in institutional care. They were rejected as so-called bastards, or the lone parent didn't have funds to raise the child. So institutional care, to a large extent, involves such children. And post-war destabilization would lead to the creation of the family and child or guardianship code in force to this day after World War II. Similarly, in other socialist countries, although their allusions or references to Soviet models was more technical and sort of surface level. Let me just show you some propaganda aspects. This is Miss Moscow visiting child care facilities in Józefów near Warsaw. Poland made a significant contribution to international acts of law to protect the child. The Convention of the Rights of the Child was created at the initiative of Poland. Poland. The draft law was prepared by Tadeusz Smyczyński from the legal faculty of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Also, the Committee for Children's Rights was an organization created in the 1980s. Its first meeting was held on the day martial law was proclaimed in Poland, and the organization worked to improve the condition of children. Thank you for your attention. If you know of any research on institutional childcare, I welcome it.
Thank you very much for this very engaging paper. I was shocked by the scale, by the numbers you've presented, and I also remember a conference we organized in Krakow about children some years ago, about the Grauta Kinder, over 100,000 children who were stolen. And now, moving on from education smoothly to propaganda, our next speaker will be Dr. Bogusław Tracz, who's an historian, a philosopher. He works at the Krakow branch of the Institute of National Remembrance. I did say Krakow. Okay, so it's not, of course, it's Katowice, not very far from Krakow. His area of expertise is social history of post-war Poland until 1989, specifically Upper Silesia, the Silesian tragedy. He's a member of the board of Communism, People Documentation, a periodical. You're all invited to contribute to that periodical. I'm looking, it's a biennial publication, and he will be talking about his topic. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for having me at this conference. I will try and... I don't see Professor Klementowski. I'll try and finish within 20 minutes. I don't see Professor Klementowski. I will begin with the concept of the longue durée, which he referred to in his presentation. Naming new cities or changing existing geographical names is a tradition that essentially dates back to antiquity, and ever since people began naming certain places, certain sites, they gave them connotations that were religious or political. As we know, politics and religion used to be for a long time, and in some cases still are intertwined. And we have cities founded by Alexander the Great, started beginning with Alexandria. We have cities founded by Roman emperors, and here it's worth mentioning Constantinople, a city founded by Constantine the Great, which was conceived as the Second Rome. And this is relevant when we look at name changes in the Soviet Union. Moscow was, in Tsarist Russia, was the Third Rome. This ideology was somehow present also in communist policy. So Constantinople is relevant in this context because it will be the starting point. It will be the point of reference, benchmark for changing names in Tsarist Russia and then in Bolshevik Russia and Soviet Russia generally. Constantinople was also called Imperial City, Tsarograd, which so it was called Tsarograd, the Grad, the city of the Tsars, of the Emperor. And this tradition was referred to by Peter the Great, by Peter the First, when he founded a city at the mouth of the Neva, St. Petersburg. This is a dual reference. It refers to St. Peter
dla wszystkich było to
but everybody was
oczywiste,
clear
że to nie do końca
that
o
it
świętego
wasn't
Piotra
entirely
w tej
the
nazwie się
saint
rozchodzi,
that
tylko
this
o,
was about, that it
prawda,
was
Piotra
clearly a way of celebrating Peter I as the founder of the city. St. Petersburg is a city, is an exemplary because it underwent numerous name changes. In 1914 it was dubbed, it was made the name became more Slavic, so instead it was Petrograd. In 1924 the name was changed to Leningrad, and in 1991 it went back to St. Petersburg. And there were numerous Peterhof towns, or towns that named after Peter in Russia. In the 18th and 19th centuries you have Petrovskaya Sloboda, Peterhof, and the list goes on.
Wymieniać. Oczywiście te nazwy
patronymic
to nie
names,
tylko, proszę Państwa, obszar Rosji, to jest jakby tradycja, która trwa, która jest w ogóle zakorzeniona w Europie, czy to w ogóle w okresie średniowiecza, czy to w czasach nowożytnych. Czasy też nowożytne to jest taka właśnie tradycja nadawania nazw od, że tak powiem, ważnych postaci
cities and were named after important politicians. Take Washington, D.C.,
Zjednoczonych to jak najbardziej tradycja oświeceniowa. No i
which
tutaj mamy
was
oczywiście, na to się
named
też nakłada tradycja
during the Enlightenment. And then you have the tradition of the French Revolution, which, as we know, attempted to introduce sweeping onomastic changes
nie do końca się to potem
and
udało.
this wasn't entirely successful.
Te próby weszły do
These attempts, however, became part of a revolutionary tradition that Lenin and his successors would refer to. The reasons for name changes were to abolish, to delete, strike out, obliterate memory, damnatio memoriae, where a name, the previous name, which symbolized the previous system, the previous regime, is no longer acceptable in a new political system. So this is an instance of
ideologicznym, no a po
this is
drugie
ideological.
nadanie jakby nowej nazwy to
There's
jest
the renaming
afirmacja
was
idei
also
lub
a way
osoby
of
związanej
affirming
z
an
nowym
idea
reżimem,
or a
prawda,
person, celebrating a person
wykreowanie
associated
pewnego
with the
kultu,
new
prawda, tutaj w
regime,
ogóle w przypadku
establishing a
kultu
cult.
danej osoby, który był w ogóle później nazywany
cult of the
w Związku
individual,
Sowieckim kultem jednostki. Jest
as it
to
was later
jak
turned into the
najbardziej
Soviet Union.
racjonalna
This
działalność
is a rational
propagandowa, czyli tutaj nie
propaganda
mamy do czynienia
move.
z żadną, że tak powiem,
It's
spontanicznością.
not
To są
spontaneous.
oczywiście działania
It's
w pełni w
clearly
ogóle zaplanowane
planned,
i przeprowadzane za pomocą aparatu
premeditated,
państwowego i to jest
and carried out by the state apparatus.
przekonanie, ta wiara w to, że prawda,
as of
słowo
in the
jest czymś,
belief,
co ma
believing
moc
that the word,
kształtowania
that
i
words
przekształcania rzeczywistości.
onto
Jakby,
places, onto
nakładając
geography,
pewną w ogóle,
onto
siatkę pojęć
towns
na
and cities, we impose
punkty,
by
miejsca,
that
nazwy
token a system of
geograficzne,
values,
miejscowości narzucamy
which
jednocześnie
is in line with
społeczeństwu
what
określony
the authorities
system.
are proclaiming. In Bolshevik
system w
Russia, the town of Zarskoye,
które
the place,
oczywiście
the village
głosi
of
władza.
Zarskoye
Już w
Sielo,
Rosji bolszewickiej w
which can be, the name can be
1918
translated
roku, proszę
as
Państwa,
the
miasto
Tsar's village,
carsko jest, znaczy miasto
was
miejscowe,
renamed Dzieckoye Sielo, a
czyli
children's village,
można to przetłumaczyć.
because the erstwhile residence of the Tsar, his family, had been transformed into a resort for children.
Dlatego, że letnia rezydencja,
this was a way
dotychczasowa
to
letnia rezydencja
emphasize
rodziny carskiej została przekształcona w ośrodek wypoczynkowy dla dzieci. Więc
that
tutaj
was
widzimy,
ideologically and politically
podkreślenie
charged.
pewnej
So what had previously
instytucjonalnej,
served
ale też w ogóle
the
zmiany
ruling
bardzo
elites,
uwarunkowanej
the
ideologicznie
czars,
i politycznie. To, co w ogóle służyło
royal
wcześniej
was now repurposed
najwyższym sferom
to serve
państwa, prawda,
children,
rządzącej,
the children of the proletariat.
rządzącej rodzinie carskiej,
And
zostaje jakby
after
przeniesione
the
i od tej
October,
pory służy
after the revolution, after the Bolsheviks took power, there was a landslide in of the name changing. This had to do with ideologization and the cult of the individual. This was as venerating a specific individual. Between 1917 and 1927, 67 towns were renamed and about 300 villages. You could say that it's quite a lot. Obviously, and of course, the most popular name was one that was that of Lenin. In his lifetime, no large town or city, but 10 villages were named after him. However, after his death, Lenin and Petrograd was in fact renamed Leningrad, and as were 15 other towns, Leninsk and so on. In 1924, Petrograd was renamed Leningrad, but and the following year, a second important city, not in the north, not in northern Russia, but in the south, the second largest city at the mouth of the Volga, Tsaritsyn, the former Tsaritsyn, became Stalingrad. And this could be read to indicate that Lenin, like whereas Lenin was the new Peter, Lenin was the founding father, but Stalin, who was alive at the time, was the new Tsar. He was because the city of Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad, so just as Petrograd was renamed Leningrad, Lenin was the new Peter, and Stalin, by the same token, was the new Tsar. And it wasn't just cities, but also mountains and peaks that were subject to name change. The highest peak in the Pamir range was named Lenin's Peak in 1928. And 4 years later, the highest tallest mountain in Tajikistan was named Stalin's Peak, and Stalin's Peak was actually taller than Lenin's Peak, so size does matter. And most of the changes took place in the 1930s. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, in the Soviet Union, 23 cities commemorated Kirov, were named after Kirov, despite the fact that Kirov had most likely been assassinated, been executed at Stalin's order. The cult of Kirov still endured. 16 towns, including and settlements, and were named after Lenin, and 12 towns were named after Stalin. Then you also had Dzierżynsk, Voroshilovgrad, Engels, Molotovo. And this model, after the war, began to be also used in the socialist bloc countries, in the countries that fell into the Soviet sphere of influence. So initially, everything remained as it was and no onomastic or no name changes were planned. However,
tutaj planowanych żadnych zmian nazw. One oczywiście nastąpiły po przejęciu
communist parties in the various countries set about changing names
typu
in the late 1940s, and this was most pronounced in 1949 when throughout the Soviet bloc Stalin's 70th birthday was celebrated. This was the largest birthday party ever thrown in the communist bloc, and at the time, for instance, the city of Varna in Bulgaria was renamed Stalin on December 20th, 1949, on Stalin's actual birthday. In 1949, in December, the highest mountain in the Carpathians and the Tatra Mountains, Mount Gerlach in Czechoslovakia, was renamed Stalinov Stit, Stalin Peak, and Mount Musala in Bulgaria, the highest peak in Bulgaria and Eastern Europe and the Balkan Peninsula, effectively was also named Stalin. In 1950, following in the wake of the changes in 1949, in the wake of the events in 1949, more cities were named after Stalin. Brasov in Romania was renamed Orașul Stalin. Kucova in Albania was also named Këlliçi Stalin, and the name would stay until 1991. So that was the longest. Most of these cities were renamed after 1956. Then you had Eisenhüttenstadt in the DDR, which was named Stalinstadt. And if we look at if we analyze it, well, Brasov is an old city. Brasov is a city with heritage. It's a medieval city full of landmarks, and there was a new district, a new industrial district being built. Kucova in Albania was a city that was enlarged, that was expanded, that was developed. So at the time, so it wasn't an old city like Brasov. As for Stalinstadt or Eisenhüttenstadt, this was a greenfield town, a city built from scratch. Previously, it had been a village. So this is a new model socialist city. In 1951, in Hungary, next to the small village of Dunapentele, they started building a large steelworks, and it was also intended, it was a new town, a greenfield practically development, which in 1951 was named Stalin Varoš. In Poland, until 1953, there was no city named after Stalin, but on March 5th, 1953, when Stalin died, the comrades in Warsaw, the authorities in Warsaw realized that the event should be commemorated in some way. We don't know exactly who because most of these decisions were made over the phone, so we don't really know whether this was something that Moscow had required or whether it was the idea came from the inner circle of the Polish United Workers' Party. Anyhow, on March 6th, Bolesław Bierut, Jakub Berman, and others decided that there should be a Polish city named after Stalin, and they started trying to pick one. There's a story, there's an anecdote named Częstochowa after Stalin. Częstochowa is the site of the shrine. It's the national shrine of Roman Catholicism, of the Marian cult in Poland. So the question was, fine, but will Poles be praying to Our Lady of Stalin? Or Our Lady of Stalingrad, that really Stalinograd, that won't do. But they did consider a number of cities, three. Łódź, first of all, Łódź, an industrial city with a workers' movement, which had revolutionary traditions. The second city that they considered under consideration was Krakow, a very old medieval city, the former capital of Poland in the Middle Ages, but also a city that had undergone transformation and that to which a new industrial district was added, a workers' district of Nowa Huta, the new steelworks, and then Katowice, a center of the most industrialized region in Poland, Upper Silesia, the Upper Silesian Industrial District. Ultimately, they chose Katowice. On March 7th, 2 days after Stalin's death, they went for Katowice, not Łódź or Krakow. And my time is up, I'm out of time, so all of this will be in the printed version of my paper, so I won't discuss the entire process of what happened, but even though it is very interesting, let me just say that as an anecdote in closing, that the first child, the first baby born, not in Katowice, but in Stalinograd, was a boy. There was a girl born on March 8th, but on March 9th, the first boy. Okay, the name was changed on March 8th officially, and at 1 a.m. on March 9th, a baby boy was born, and he was, of course, given the name Joseph. And after 1956, his name was changed to Zbigniew. So the person has since changed his name to Zbigniew. So this Joseph was, as an adult, as a grown-up, after he graduated. So he joined the secret police in Katowice. He became a member of the... All right, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll provide more details in the written version.
Był w życiu, że tak powiem, dojrzałym, kiedy już skończył szkoły, został
Thank you very much for this intriguing paper, which shows us how totalitarian systems use or how they...
Dziękujemy bardzo za również ciekawe wystąpienie.
Thank you very much for this intriguing paper, which shows us how totalitarian systems use or how they trickle down or they become part of universal mental structures that are characteristic of religious thought. We all remember the book by Marcin Kula, Religion Like Communism, whereas others scholars state that totalitarian systems, including communism, are religions. So our journey across the sea of ideology and propaganda is slowly coming to an end, where we've almost reached the shore. Our final paper is titled "The Courtesan Organ in the Struggle Against the Class Enemy, Judiciary, Private Property, and the Seizure of Assets in Croatia, Yugoslavia after World War II." And our speaker is Professor Tomislav Anić from the Faculty of History at the Catholic University of Croatia and Zagreb. He researches social history, the political history of Croatia in the 20th century.
I want to present the issue of private property and the seizure of assets in Croatia, Yugoslavia after World War II, a period marked by radical ideological and systematic transformation. The period represents not only economic but also a deeply political and metamorphosis crucial for understanding the specific characteristic of the Yugoslav socialist model. With this presentation, I want to explain the relationship of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to property, the legal mechanism of nationalization, the role of judiciary, and the far-reaching political, economic, and social consequence of this process. In the first part of this presentation, I would like to explain the relationship of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to property, from ideology to practice, from ideology to pragmatism. The fundamental stance of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia on property was firmly rooted in Marxist-Leninist ideology, with the clear goal of abolishing private ownership of the means of production. The Communist Party program, adopted in 1920 at the Second Party Congress, explicitly stated that the dictatorship of the proletariat will carry out the expropriation of big capitalists and large landowners to convert the means of production and transport into the collective property of the workers state, envisioned to take over of banks, entire industrial branches and estates. The ultimate goal was complete control over the means of production. This early ideological commitment means that any later recognition of private property, especially during the war, was exclusively tactically and temporary. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia demonstrated tactical flexibility during the World War II. In February 1942, it adopted the FOČA regulations, establishing the National Liberation Committees as temporary authorities responsible for managing economic entities that came under their control after successful military operations. In September 1942, the order of National Liberation Committee's election further specified this system, placing key public and state facilities such railways, mines, factories, and the larger enterprises under military administration. This measure were the first steps towards state control of property, long before formal nationalization laws, and were justified by wartime necessity. A significant tactical shift occurred in May 1943. The communists recognized inviolability of private property. This public stance was a strategic response to what they called false propaganda from political opponents, and it had a dual objective: to mobilize a broader segment of the population and to project a more moderate image of the communists. This demonstrated that Communist Party of Yugoslavia skill in adopting its public narrative to immediate political needs. A key turning point occurred when Tito-Šubašić agreement in the second half of 1944 and the Yalta recommendation in February 1945, which were crucial for achieving international recognition of the new government. It was agreed that the new Yugoslav government would be formed by Tito and Ivan Šubašić, representative of Yugoslav emigre government in London. It was also stipulated that politically uncompromised members of the pre-war Yugoslav Assembly would be included in the supreme legislative and executive representative body of Yugoslavia, so-called AVNOJ, Anti-Fascistic Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia. Repeated public guarantees of inviolability of private property during this period served to maintain an international facade until full recognition of the Yugoslavia state led by communists was succeed. This clearly indicates that the timing of the Communist Party Yugoslavia revolutionary economic agenda was strategically determined by changing international political circumstances. In November 1945, elections, which were far from free and, of course, fair, primarily due to manipulation of the votes list, multiple voting, falsification of result. The list of the People's Front of Yugoslavia, led by Tito, won. After election, Constituent Assembly proclaimed the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. And 2 months later, the constitution was adopted on January 31, 1946. The constitution defined 3 types of ownership: state, cooperative, and private. Although the constitution guaranteed private property, it simultaneously defined all people's property. Mineral resources, for example, transport and communication, and gave the state the authority to limit or expropriate private property if it is general interest based on law. This legal framework provided a broad, seemingly legitimate path for future nationalization, moving from revolutionary confiscation to constitutional sanctioned process. The adoption of the law on the nationalization of private economy enterprises on December 6, 1946 was a key moment. The law was prepared in strict secrecy to prevent the removal of assessed. Boris Kidrić, then president of government's economic council, justified the law by emphasizing its necessity for further economic development with the help of planned economy. The law transferred ownership of private enterprises in almost all sectors of the economy to the state. The vice president of the People's Republic of Yugoslavia government, Edvard Kardelj, confirmed in his memoirs that the notorious fact that Yugoslav communists copied the Soviet political and economic system. He stated that after the war, there were many more important things than devising economy policy. Although confiscation, expropriation, and nationalization differ legally, their application in Yugoslav context blurred this distinction. Semantic manipulation of this concept was crucial for managing internal and external perceptions. The direction of the Presidium of Anti-Fascist Council of the National Liberation of Yugoslavia of November 21, 1944, on the transfer of enemy property to state ownership was the fundamental legal act for widespread property transfer. It targeted the property of the German Reich, German citizens and collaborators with the occupiers and war criminals, with an extremely broad definition of enemy and collaborator. This allowed the new regime to target a wide range of individuals and entities, effectively using the wartime context to justify ideologically motivated confiscations. The law on confiscation property and the execution of confiscation, adopted on June 8, 1945, aimed to standardize the confiscation process and ensure that all confiscated property passed into state ownership. Decision on confiscation could be made by administrative authorities, regular courts, military courts, and courts for the protection of the national honor. The emphasis of uniformity and legality suggests an attempt to introduce order into a previously chaotic process, but within the framework of revolutionary justice. Sequestration, although theoretically a temporary and preventive measure, in practice often served as the temporary deferral before the final transfer property to the state ownership, which was in fact de facto nationalization. Boris Klejdi explicitly stated that the entire accumulation fell under sequestration, which meant the same as nationalization. This allowed the state to extract value and integrate this property into the planned economy while awaiting more favorable international circumstances for formal nationalization. The legal provision on economic cooperation with the enemy were a powerful instrument for the new regime. The deliberately vague interpretation of voluntarians were merely engaging in business during the occupation was sufficient for guilt, turned economic activity under occupation into the potentially criminal offense, which in practice became the rule. The voluntarians instrument served as a legal excuse for a broad economic purge, allowing the state to seize private property to eliminate a segment of the population that could potentially resist social transformation. Then I want to explain the role of courts and judicial apparatus. The National Commission ascertaining the crimes of the occupiers and their collaborators, established in May 1944, had extensive investigative powers and extend the legal institution of war crime of economic activities. The brief oral procedure prioritized speed over traditional legal process, indicating a system designed for rapid property transfer. The National Commission of Ascertaining the Crimes of the Occupiers and the Collaborators was a central instrument of political and economic cleansing for breaking up the pre-war economic elite and transferring their property to the state. The institution of the public prosecutor, established in Croatia in February 1945, was tasked with supreme oversight over the accurate fulfillment of laws. Jakub Blažević, public prosecutor of People Republic of Croatia, clearly articulated the role of this institution in taking over economy positions from enemies, emphasizing that the juridical possibility of destroying enemies was understood as the seizure of the economy means. The public prosecutor's office was not just a legal institution, but a strategic tool for identifying and legally facilitating the transfer of private economy power to the state. The concept of revolutionary legality adherence, demand adherence, the latter, but also the spirit of the law, providing a flexible framework that allowed the new regime to selectively apply or disregard existing laws. This concept served as a powerful ideological and legal justification for the systematic dismantling of the old legal order regarding property. The requirement that every judge be a true man of the people and protect the achievement of the national liberation struggle undermined the principle of judicial independence. Political loyalty and ideological alignment were paramount, overriding traditional legal expertise. Systematic ideological re-education and vetting of judicial personnel ensured that the courts would actively participate in the revolutionary transformation rather than acting as a check on state power. In the fourth part of my presentation, I would explain consequences of nationalization, political, economic, and social. Nationalization measures were direct means by which the Communist Party of Yugoslavia moved from theoretical framework to practice. In this way, it established the leading position in all social organization and government bodies. By controlling the means of production, the party secured its undisputed political hegemony, effectively removing all independent power bases that could threaten its dominance. Economic consequence. Nationalization was considered a necessary measure for the creation of All People's Party as the material basis for a planned economy. The planned economy aimed for intensive electrification and industrialization, which were considered crucial for the country's development. A key justification was the protection of the country from the influence of exploitation and foreign capital, thereby ensuring national economy independence. By concentrating all economy resources, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia aimed to accelerate economic growth and modernization, thereby legitimizing its authority and social consequence. Nationalization led to significant restructuring on the social ladder, where previous holders of property rights became deprived, usually without compensation. This created two antagonistic groups, disposed capitalist and revolutionary forces. The concept of all people's property became central, representing collective ownership of the means of production. The nationalization process was a radical project of social engineering aimed at eliminating the capitalist class and established a new social order. This radical treatment of industrial plant owners, based on their condemnation for operating businesses during World War II, can be characterized as a class genocide. And for conclusion, the measure of property nationalization, confiscation, sequestration, and expropriation were fundamentally class-based, aimed at dismantling the capitalist system and eliminating class relations in favor of socialist society. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia systematically disposed capital holders, often under pretext of collaborating with the enemy to remove their economy and political influence. Yugoslavia adopted the Soviet Stalinist socio-economic model as a blueprint for its socialist transformation. The Communist Party of Yugoslavia meticulously developed a legal framework from wartime regulation to the 1946 Constitution and the law of nationalization to facilitate the systematic transfer of private property to the state. The judiciary and legal apparatus were instrumentalized, operating under the principle of revolutionary legality and staffed by ideologically aligned personnel to implement these changes. Thank you very much. Dziękuję.
Dziękujemy za ten ważny też.
Thank you very much for this important contribution, which addressed an important subject. The narrative about enemies and class enemies was indeed a foundationally founding narrative for the communists. Now we have
discussion right now. Przed nami właśnie będzie teraz czas.
Okay, now we'll have a discussion.
Myślę, że tutaj patrzę w stronę
I'm looking at
dr Szyc, 20
Dr.
minut na
Szyc,
dyskusję.
so let's have 20 minutes.
Jest godzina 11, więc o 11:20 udamy się wszyscy
and we'll have a break at
20-minutową
11:20.
przerwę, więc
20-minute break.
wracamy zgodnie z planem za 20:12, tak rozpoczniemy obrady. Zatem zaprosiłbym wszystkich panelistów tutaj na krzesła, którzy są obecni na sali. Profesor musiał wyjść na chwilę, ale jeśli będą pytania do niego, to również będzie możliwość, żeby na te pytania odpowiedział. Więc proszę bardzo, paneliści, tutaj zapraszam na środek. Tutaj pierwsze pytanie.
My thanks to all the presenters for their presentations. My question is for Dr. Wiśniewska. Obviously a very exciting and moving subject. Orphanage on an enormous scale. So 2.5 million German orphans. Has there been any research done about all those Stiefkinder der Republik? So there's a huge number of orphans in the care of the state in the GDR. What was their political loyalty as adults? Did they reward the state by being loyal to the communist regime? Or did they turn against the state? Or was there no trend at all? Did they just think for themselves? How they were obviously subject to enormous state indoctrination and state care. Could she say more about that, the indoctrination they experienced, and whether it led to actual support for the state, political support for the state, or whether it didn't, whether it completely failed? Could you say more about that? Thank you.
Dziękuję pięknie. Chciałam tutaj też zapytanie.
Yes, thank you. I also wanted to thank you for your interest in my subject, and I want to take advantage of the opportunity to plug a book by my colleague, Dr. Magdalena Lemańczyk, from the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences, written together with Professor Madajczyk, which is about the children in the GDR, and it's really worth looking into. The bibliography is particularly interesting as regards post-war orphans in the GDR and Germany generally, because we have the occupation zones. So the literature is extensive, and we also need to take into account children who were resettled, displaced children, about 4 million children from, among others, Poland. Today's Poland. This research is being conducted, and as regards the educational policy in People's Poland and its implementation, I want to refer you to the annals of the history of education, which cover selected issues that you've touched upon. As regards the practice and how it translated, and a comparative approach, a comparative study, how that compared to Poland, and how we can, how this in Poland as compared to the GDR. Well, that's still ahead of me. I'm sure that in the GDR, the indoctrination was more profound, more extensive, because the Stiefkinder der Republik, that phrase, that was a concept that the child was exposed to all their life. The state was institutionalized. A lot of, so from as soon as they were from birth, the child was raised by the state. In the 80s, the state covered 85% of the child rearing costs, so the child became, in a way, property of the state, which translated into, which was related to women's careers. Women were professionally active in the DDR, more so than in other socialist countries. 80-90% of women at the end of the period in question were working, had jobs. Indoctrination was a matter of was programmatic. It also had a visual aspect. It also was general, was very overall. But the main problem is the process, is how the child became the property of the state, and that had consequences. I intend to pursue the matter further, but to what extent did it? I mean, to some extent, it has been studied. At least the Herder Institute, the book published by the Herder Institute, might be interesting here. I'm not sure she answered. Robert Fuss, good morning. A question on Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, Tito in his time was more Stalinist than Stalin in his day, and in 1947, and the Commonform, and then in 48, the Commonform was disbanded, and he split from the Soviet bloc, which he could afford to do. This was the right way to go, but the Soviet bloc wasn't consolidated. Yugoslavia left, but Albania was a strong link in the bloc, but only in the 1950s. After the 20th Congress, Enver Hoxha started, also went isolationist. In 1962, he stopped taking part in military exercises. In 68, he opted for China. Yes, could you move on to the question, please? This was, according to Mao, I'm sorry, that was socialism in Europe. But in 1970, China, in 1977, China broke with Albania, I'm sorry, and Yugoslavia, which had been accused by the Chinese leadership of revisionism and crypto-capitalism. So Yugoslavia became China's best friend in Europe, a friend of China in Europe. So how could you explain Chinese policy here in the Wahwafen, and this as a continuation of Mao Zedong? China, apart from, okay, can we possibly let our panelists answer the question, which isn't directly related to the topics, but if any of you gentlemen would care to answer, then we'd appreciate it.
Jeśli któryś z panów doktorów podjął rękawice, to...
This is not the topic of what I was discussing, but since it involved Albania, well, from the Albanian perspective, let's see it this way. Albania's best friend in the early days of communism was Yugoslavia. But since the grip of Yugoslavia became too strong on Albania, there was a traditional, some kind of opposition grew stronger inside the Albanian communist leadership due to historical legacies of relations between Yugoslavia and Albania, which I'm not going to go through. But by the 50s and onward, Albania tried to select its eastern friends based on the relation they had with Yugoslavia. So Albanians became increasingly nervous once Khrushchev started mending relations with Yugoslavia, and Albania became increasingly nervous when the Chinese started their reforms, which meant a certain opening to the Eastern Bloc. So this is basically the story of the relations between Albania and Yugoslavia, which was based on two tensions: ideological tensions, but first of all, geopolitical tensions. That was the fear of being incorporating in a country which was stronger, bigger, economically more sound, and the idea was to preserve independence, which granted also the permanence of leading of Enver Hoxha and all the leading bloc of the Communist Party. So isolation was thought as some kind of preservation of power. It preserved power. That's how it worked in Albania.
Dziękujemy bardzo.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes. A question to Professor Bogusław Tracz, a two-part question. In 1953, Katowice was renamed Stalinograd. In 1956, it went back to its original name. After the first and second decision, were there any organizations, any campaigns, any statements? Did anybody comment on that? Were any discontent or indeed enthusiasm in 1953 or 1956? Did the people in the city respond in any way? As regards 1953, apart from one protest organized by the students in the city of Chorzów, in the nearby city, there was a leaflet campaign in the nearby city of Chorzów, which is wrongly associated with a protest against the name change. So there was really nothing. The response didn't exist. Most of the population, at least based on reports written by the security offices, most of the population responded were surprised, obviously, because it took place overnight, with no notice, no notification. It was a fait accompli, and so people woke up one day in a town, and there were loudspeakers at the train station. The PA system, the loudspeakers at the train station started saying, "This is the city of Stalinograd. Your train has arrived," and the people were surprised. So actually, there were no organized forms of protest against the name change. That's 1953, and it's so full Stalinization, and I think it was actually inconceivable. It's not something that could have happened. But the restoring the old name in 1956, which officially happened only in 1957, in December 1956, the voivodeship, the regional committee of the Polish Unity Party in Katowice, sent a question to the Central Committee. The Central Committee approved, but then that needed a full official procedure, for the full legislative procedure. But as of the end of 1956, people started speaking of Katowice again, calling it Katowice again, which I think was officially only confirmed in February or March 1957. People were happy. People were generally happy with the changes with 1956, with the changes that 1956 brought about. But when you look if you look at the newspapers, it's something that's mentioned on page 2 or 3, a small news item to the effect saying that Katowice has regained its old name. So it wasn't really. So the name change in 1953 was accompanied by a propaganda campaign, articles written, and so on. There was, but the second name change, going back, was done in like kid gloves, you could say. So the name just again, all of a sudden, they went back to the original name, and people treated it as a fait accompli. We have 4 minutes. One last question. Now I see 2 questions, and perhaps we can leave the other questions for the informal session.
Question to Dr. Tracz. I found your presentation very interesting, even entertaining. Except toponyms, have you researched naming the firms, the enterprises after the prominent party leaders in Poland or elsewhere? It was a quite common practice in Yugoslavia, so if you would share some experience, maybe. Thank you.
Yes, of course. These name changes occurred mainly in 1949 during to celebrate the 70th anniversary, 70th birthday of Joseph Stalin. So the coal mine in Sosnowiec, a large coal mine, Sosnowiec, also a Silesian city, was named after Stalin. A large steelworks in Łabędy, also next, which was part of the Polish defense industry, which produced metal for the defense industry, was also named after Stalin. The famous factory
Cegielskiego. Cegielski był ich, prawda, właścicielem jeszcze na przełomie XIX i XX wieku. Później były w ogóle nazywane zakładami Cegielskiego. W Poznaniu też w ogóle otrzymały imię Józefa Stalina, więc jakby tych nazw było dużo. Oprócz tego oczywiście nie tylko imiona Stalina, ale co jest na przykład ciekawe, prawie był w tym takim nazewnictwie z zakładów pracy, był w ogóle prawie nieobecny Lenin. Natomiast Stalin już tak, prawda? Stalin tutaj w ogóle dominował. No i oczywiście różnego rodzaju polscy komuniści, prawda? Którzy się gdzieś tam w ogóle wpisywali w ten taki etos stalinowski. No. Dziękuję.
No i też kombinat w Krakowie był imieniem Lenina.
Kombinat był imieniem Lenina. Nie?
Dziękujemy również za ten komentarz. Dziękujemy Państwu, ale przede wszystkim dziękujemy naszym prelegentom za ciekawe referaty i rozmowę. I widzimy się z powrotem o 11:40. Dziękuję uprzejmie.